Hello and welcome to this webinar, The New Cold War is Making Us Poorer, brought to you by No Cold War Britain. My name is Fiona, I'm from the No Cold War Britain Committee, and it's great to see so many of you here today to join this really important discussion. We're meeting today amidst a really severe economic crisis in Britain. The International Monetary Fund has just released figures saying that the British economy is projected to contract by 0.3% this year. So this is all fueling the cost of living crisis, which is seeing soaring energy bills, public services being slashed, wages aren't being kept up with inflation, and we've got a Tory government which is intent on making things worse with their vicious austerity policy. Britain's aggressive foreign policy is also making matters much worse. We've got massive military spending. Billions are being poured into NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. The British government is shunning vital trading partner China through all of its aggressive policies, which includes sending warships to the South China Sea. However, this link between the cost of living crisis and the new Cold War is not well understood or discussed in Britain. We're experiencing a situation of blanket propaganda. And one of the things that No Cold War Britain's hoping to do tonight and moving forward is to shine a light on the truth and challenge this Cold War consensus. Really delighted that we have such an amazing lineup of speakers tonight from the peace movement, the trade union movement, progressive media, and we've also got an economist too. There's going to be time this evening, not only to hear from this great lineup of speakers, but also to have a Q&A after the speeches. So please do put in your questions in the Zoom function as we go along, and there will be an opportunity later to get some answers to these questions. I also just want to say, make sure you are following No Cold War Britain on social media. It's vital that we're getting the word out, getting out an alternative view to wall-to-wall Cold War propaganda. And also make sure you're reading the Morning Star, who we have an important partnership with. We're delighted that we get an opportunity to put out articles through this really great newspaper. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's been with No Cold War since the beginning, since we launched in 2020, Kate Hudson, who is the General Secretary of CND. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Fiona. It's good to be here to discuss this topical and very important issue. And I'd like to just speak briefly about military spending and Britain's developing policy towards China. Last month's budget was announced against a backdrop of public sector strikes and widespread protests. They were calling on the government to ensure decent wage increases and to address the cost of living crisis. As usual, the government claimed there was no money available. Yet just 2 days earlier, Rishi Sunak had announced that there would be an additional £5 billion worth of military spending over 2 years. This takes UK military spending up to 2.2% of GDP this year. That's also actually 2.29 if you include spending on the Ukraine war. And he also announced a new aspiration, quotes, to reach 2.5%. In money terms, this is rapidly taking us towards 50 billion a year and is well in excess of the required level of spending for NATO members. That's 2% of GDP. 3 out of this 5 billion increase will go to what's called the Defence Nuclear Enterprise. That includes spending on submarines and, quotes, supporting the delivery of AUKUS. That's the pact between Australia, UK and US, which aims, amongst other joint military projects, to provide nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. The remaining 2 billion is for replenishing military stockpiles and improving the UK's munitions infrastructure. In fact, last month, the military announcements were coming thick and fast. Sunak went to the US to meet with Joe Biden and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to announce the latest news on the AUKUS Pact. After 18 months of speculation about how the US and UK could live up to their promise of supplying subs to Australia to make up for the ones they cancelled from France, they revealed that the US will sell Australia between 3 and 5 Virginia-class submarines, either new or second-hand, in the early 2030s. These will boost the Australian submarine force until it can build its own. They hope to do so in the late 2030s. To do this, Australia will work with the UK on the design for the new subs. Britain will build its own subs at Barrow to eventually replace the current Astute-class subs, and Australia will assemble its own subs, which will include parts made in Britain. The nuclear reactor units which power the subs will be made in Britain at the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby. Meanwhile, Australian submariners will train on US and UK subs, and there will be a rotating permanent force of 1 UK Astute and up to 4 US Virginia subs in Western Australia from 2027. There are many other elements to this military cooperation, but that's the most controversial because of the risk of nuclear proliferation. Both US and UK submarines reactors are fueled by weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium. This is already causing concern and tension in the region, and it will make it more intensely militarized, as well as tying Australia firmly into the US's anti-China framework. The same day that all this came out, the UK government also launched its update of Boris Johnson's integrated review, which he published 2 years ago. This was Johnson's strategic vision for a global Britain, which I described at the time as an attack document. Its key feature was the so-called Indo-Pacific tilt, the UK's part of supporting the US anti-China agenda in that region. When Sunak was introducing the updated review last month, he said that he was proud that the UK had delivered the ambition it set for the Indo-Pacific tilt. He outlined various ways in which relations in the region had been strengthened, including deploying a UK carrier strike group and 2 offshore patrol vessels to the region. He also highlighted what he called 2 major defence and security partnerships. First is AUKUS, and then there's also the Global Combat Air Programme, which is being undertaken with Italy and Japan. There are even, in fact, attempts to bring Japan into the AUKUS agreement. So the air programme is to build a common fighter jet to replace both the Eurofighter Typhoon used by the UK and Italy and the Mitsubishi F2 used by Japan. The update to the review was actually first suggested by the Liz Truss government to take into account the new context of the Ukraine war and the increased tension with China. The Truss government actually aimed to increase military spending to 3% of GDP. But with the collapse of the Truss government following the fiasco of last September's mini-budget, the increase has actually been less. Ben Wallace was demanding £11 billion, but got £5 billion. But there will be many more points in the near future where that figure may well increase. There's a Defence Command paper scheduled for June this year. Who knows what that will bring? And a Defence Nuclear Strategy also planned for later in the year. Both may well come up with additional spending, so we need to keep an eye on that. The most concerning thing about the review update is the way government thinking has developed with regard to China, talking of its more aggressive stance in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. Johnson's review had committed to what it described as strengthening the UK's domestic resilience and international partnerships, partly in response to the epoch-defining and systemic challenge posed by China under the Chinese Communist Party across almost every aspect of national life and government policy, including a new focus on tackling state threats to the UK's democracy, economy and society, and protecting our science and technological base. This position is now reinforced in the update, which also highlights what it describes as a growing convergence of authoritarian states challenging the basic conditions for an open, stable and peaceful international order, working together to undermine the international system or remake it in their image. Now, I'm sure many of you will think back to the language that was introduced by the Trump administration when the conflict was being ramped up with China, and it is very, very reminiscent of that. So to conclude, Fiona, hope I haven't gone on too long, there is much to learn from this updated integrated review about the UK's approach to China. I don't have time to address masses of it here, but it's well worth reading. You can just Google it and it'll come up. And if you want to really understand where the government is going with this, what we can expect in the months and years to come, I do highly recommend you to read it. And of course, in understanding that, it will help us work out how we can best organise to halt this accelerating drive towards war. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Kate. That's excellent analysis to kick off the meeting and really drawing in some really important points that we as a movement need to be uniting around, mobilising on, including this awful AUKUS pact, and the fact that there are trends in the upper echelons of the Tory party calling for more and more military spending at a time when Britain's military spending is already the 4th largest in the world. So there's a lot of threats already on the table, and the trajectory at the moment is escalation. So thanks very much, Kate, for sharing that with us. Our next speaker is Roger McKenzie, who is the international editor of the Morning Star. And as I said before, the Morning Star is a crucial partner for No Cold War Britain and is playing a brilliant role in challenging the new Cold War consensus against the mainstream media, which is, basically putting out a lot of myths and really pro-war propaganda. So we're really grateful to have Roger join us tonight. Over to you, Roger.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you so much for inviting me and to be part of this brilliant panel. Really in awe of everybody on this panel. It's been really looking forward to this discussion tonight. Of course, at a time when people are struggling to put bread on the table and struggling to keep a roof over their heads, it's worth just reflecting a little bit on where Kate just ended in her contribution about you've got all these Tories that are running around saying we should spend more on the military. Well, there's a reason for that, of course, and it's the age-old problem of capitalism. It's about profit at the end, and it's about the profits that their mates who buy and sell politicians across the world, not just in the UK, but it's the profits that these arms manufacturers, the military, will continue to make out of wars across the country. So they're encouraging, of course, this so-called new Cold War. I don't think there's been a particular gap, to be honest, to have something new when they just continue. It's like a continual line of who is next in line to be in the crosshairs of the United States, because in the end, I think that's where you have to go with this. You have to look at the role that the United States plays, because I don't believe that there's certainly not a country, certainly not on the G7, who are going through their series of meetings just now, certainly not in NATO. None of these countries have an independent foreign policy. They certainly don't have an independent military policy. What they do is they follow the diktat of the United States. So what is that diktat? Where is that actually coming from? And I've kind of was struggling for this for years, and somebody just then told me that, well, it's quite simple. There's this thing called full spectrum dominance. And this full spectrum dominance sounds like something out of Star Wars or something, but actually it's really quite simple for the United States. What they say is that we will make sure that the financial and military interests of the United States win at all costs, and we will take any means necessary to achieve that. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that if China is now the most dominant economic power in the world, then the United States simply can't have that. They rely on their power through the dollar in particular, to be able to apply sanctions to countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, Iran, a whole bunch of countries. And frankly, it doesn't matter what you think of the politics of a particular country. It's the idea that the United States is able to dominate the world through the dollar and is able to dominate the world through their military might. So the fact that they can, so many thousands of miles away from the shores of the USA, decide that they can, in the South China Seas, have their military vessels patrolling around, because apparently it's about free waters or something. I don't think that's the exact phrase that they use, but they can do anything that they want. And it is part of this full spectrum dominance, because actually what they're doing is that they're looking after the interests of capital in the United States. And I think we just have to be clear with people that that's what it is. They would, in a country like the United States, where poverty is massive, homelessness is massive, where people, never mind we're struggling to put bread on the table and keep a roof over our heads. In the United States, it's even worse. It's much, much worse, because they don't even pretend that they're going to put money into public services. And what they will do, though, and they don't apologize for it, is to put money into the military. So when we think of why this is happening, it's essentially about protecting profits. It's essentially about protecting the dominance of the United States. So, but the question is always, what is it that we can do about it? Are we just going to meet and debate this stuff and just say, well, it's just too difficult, we can't do anything about this, and we'll just have to hope that there's a kind of knight in shining armor waiting to come to our rescue, whether it's Lula or President Xi or whoever? And actually, I have great respect for those people, but I don't think we should be leaving it to other people to come to build the movement that's necessary to get something done. But I also think that movement that's developed by working people across the globe, because I think we have to look at this globally and look at the alliances, the coalitions that need to be built globally, like the BRICS initiative that's taking place, like the development of the new bank to undermine the power of the dollar. I think all of those things are vitally important, but what we have to do is to build the worker-to-worker contacts across the globe that will make a difference. The international peace movement that I know Kate in particular spent so many years working on developing brilliantly over the years, but I think we really need to put our efforts into making sure that that international peace movement is as strong as it possibly can be, because we need to make sure that it's the people who are saying, we're not prepared for you to be pushing working class people into battles to fight for your profits, when actually what we want is working class people working together in collaboration, in cooperation, to bring wealth to people in places like Africa, in places like across Asia, who are really struggling to survive. So one of the things that I'd like to see, and I've written about this elsewhere, is to look at what we can do to revitalize the non-aligned movement across the world. And maybe what we see with the BRICS initiative is the kind of embryo of that, with people across the global south coming together to work to bring about positive politics, real progressive politics, but also understanding that even with across that global south, there's going to be a whole bunch of different politics. But I think our politics as socialists, and some of us are communists, but as socialists, is about making sure that our politics is clear to people, that we are able to put our arguments, that we're not demonized by our politics, but that actually we're able to say what we're after is not a world where countries like the United States, like the UK, like France, like Germany, like the EU are content to talk about war when we want to talk about peace, We want to talk about making sure that people have what they need to live. And it's not just about bread on the table, but it's about prospering as societies as well. So I think there's a golden opportunity here. I'll conclude on this. I think there's a golden opportunity for us all here, because I do see some real glimmers of hope. I see people standing up across the world and not just accepting stuff. And I don't just mean the politicians, I mean people. One of the things that I get to write about every day are the peace movements, are the people who are organizing to get things done. And I think one of the things that we bring to the table from the Morning Star is to amplify those voices, because I think the more those voices are amplified, the more people think we can do that as well, and they'll start the movements off within their countries as well. So if we want to see peace, if we want to make progress, if we want to challenge the dominance of the United States, if we want to challenge the full spectrum dominance of the United States, we have to be developing our own full spectrum resistance to their dominance. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, Roger. Thanks so much for that. And I mean, it's really important. We can feel very lonely and a little bit disheartened at times in Britain, because I think we are in a minority, but it's vital to remember we're part of the global majority. We've got to listen to the voices like Lula, which are speaking up for peace, the global South leaders that are saying we want peace in Ukraine. We don't get to hear those voices in our very biased media, but the Morning Star does a brilliant job in putting those out there. So it's really important that everyone subscribes to the Morning Star, reads it, retweets it, etc. And this point also that Roger emphasised around who is behind this aggression. We get a narrative which is like, oh, you know, plague on all your houses, equal aggression. Well, no, this new Cold War is the United States' new Cold War, and it's got its allies, chief among them Britain, going along with it. But the majority of the world, including China, does not want this to be taking place. I think that is really two very valuable amongst the rest of the great points that Roger made that I think we need to remember moving forward. Our next speaker tonight is colleague from the No Cold War Britain Committee, Bob Oram. He's also on the Morning Star Management Committee and has been active in the trade union movement and peace movements for a very long time. So I'm really happy to introduce Bob. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That's really nice. Yeah, I have got a history in the peace movement, I suppose. In 1999, I went with the MPs Alice Mahn and Tam Dayel to see the effect of NATO's dreadful bombing of Yugoslavia. I saw things there that really affected me and have lived with me for ever since. Horrific atrocities were committed. And if you saw what I did, you'd never, ever be in favour of war, nor would you trust our mainstream politicians either. The BBC estimated it cost us more than £30 billion for the 78 days of non-stop bombing. I believe all of that money should have been spent on something which would have benefited people and society. 25 years later, and here we are again paying for the latest NATO war. The USA, the head of NATO and the largest provider of military assistance to Ukraine, has spent since February 2022 $32.5 billion. Our government on March the 30th, 23, said we have spent $2.3 billion in military assistance to the Ukraine so far and pledged to match that again this year. We are also training 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers by the end of 2023, but they didn't say what that would cost. I couldn't even begin to guess what it would, but I know it would be better spent on our NHS staff. Last October, the USA published its National Security Strategy Report. That states we are in the midst of a strategic competition to shape the future of the international order. And President Biden assures us that the United States has everything we need to win the competition for the 21st century. Up the China threat narrative, bedrock of the new Cold War we are in now. So fast forward to the 8th of March this year, and the USA Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, said the Communist Party of China represents both the leading and most consequential threat to US national security and leadership globally. Within days, not to be outdone, as Kate's already said, Sunak releases the UK's integrated review refresh, which says China poses an epoch-defining challenge to the type of international order we want to see, both in terms of security and values. You may not have heard of the IRR, especially with a title like that, but as Kate said, it's worth downloading and reading. It's 60 pages long, and they're very dangerous pages. But I think it's vital that people understand what our government is proposing to do. It brags about strengthening the UK's domestic resilience and international partnerships, partly in response to the epoch-defining and systemic challenge posed by China under the Chinese Communist Party across almost every aspect of national life and government policy. Every aspect of our national life and government policy is under threat of the Chinese Communist Party. It's incredible. It then says the CCP is increasingly explicit in its aim to shape a China-centric international order, more favourable to its authoritarian system, and pursuing this ambition through a wide-ranging strategy, shaping global governance in ways that undermine individual rights and freedoms, and pursuing coercive practices. The IRR mentions China 39 times. I wonder why. Biden admits the US is not powerful enough to defeat China on its own in his page 11 of the NSSR. He says, "We will build the strongest possible coalition of nations to enhance our collective influence, to shape the global strategic environment, and to solve shared challenges." These are not nations from the global south, because the majority of those do not support either the USA war against Russia or the new Cold War against China. It is nations like us. The USA likewise knows their only hope of recovering the status as the world's biggest economy is military, and they need allies to achieve that. The USA has invested about 2.4 trillion in armaments since 2020. And on March the 28th this year, it set a new budget of 842 billion. Whether you add in nuclear weapons work at the Department for Energy and other department associated spending, it's likely that the figure in total for this year will be $1 trillion. In a country with so much poverty, that is obscene. 29 European states have also pledged more than 209 billion in new defence funding, a figure that will certainly continue to rise. This great global rearmament is now taking place, and it will be financed by deep cuts to public spending while profiteering the world's biggest arms dealer, the USA. The USA has to go to war, as Roger said, because economically China has now surpassed the USA. China's Great Road is a superb book by John Ross, who is also on the steering committee of No Cold War, but it shows the case comprehensively. And the International Comparison Programme of the World Development Indicators database showed in 2021 the USA economy at $23 trillion and China at 27.31. So as the NSSR makes clear, the post-Cold War era is definitely over, and a competition is now underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. It describes both the actual purpose, which is a battle for global domination, and how it will be marketed as a fight for democratic ideals. That's why the word democracy appears 38 times in that report, which is a bit rich coming from a country founded on the genocide of all its people and the very undemocratic enslavement of millions of Black Africans. The National Security Strategy report is followed up by the National Defence Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defence Review. The Nuclear Posture Review says the United States will, for the first time in its history, face two major nuclear powers as strategic competitors and potential adversaries. Instead of seeking peace, it has a modernisation plan to upgrade its nuclear arsenal at a cost of $1.2 trillion. One of its goals is to achieve the US objectives if deterrence fails. And it says we will maintain a safe, secure and effective nuclear deterrent and a flexible nuclear capability to achieve our objectives. Should the president conclude that the employment of nuclear weapons is necessary. In such circumstances, the United Nations would seek to end any conflict at the lowest level of damage possible on the best achievable terms for the United States and its allies. As the only nation that has actually used nuclear weapons, not once, but twice, I have no doubt they will justify doing it again. China's economic growth directly threatens US corporate interests, and the pressure of capitalist competition compels them to use every possible means, including nuclear weapons now, to retain their perceived global dominance. If trade sanctions continue and the arms race continues, then wars will also continue as they have throughout capitalist society for nearly 300 years. As long as all this exists, lasting peace is impossible. It is not enough to say no to war. We must start to really challenge the lie that workers and capitalists have a common interest in the war which is coming. Quite the opposite. All over the world, workers and rising up against the rising cost of living, poverty wages, the loss of public services, and deteriorating working conditions. We must end this insane drive to war and end the artificial division of humanity into warring classes and nations. That is why no Cold War is so important, and if we are going to solve our common problems and save our future. Thank you.
Brilliant, Bob. Thanks so much for that. I think one of the key points to take from that is, where is British foreign policy going with this very weirdly named integrated review refresh? Well, it's going in step with the United States in a more and more aggressive trajectory. And I think the point being made that, you know, the United States is losing in economic competition with China, and so the threat of war grows larger and larger. And, you know, at the moment we're talking about no Cold War, but of course we're also against a hot war. I just want to hand over now to fellow co-chair Sequoyah, who's going to guide us through the rest of the meeting, including the Q&A. So over to you, Sequoyah.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. As Fiona mentioned, my name's Sequoyah de Souza, and I'll be chairing the rest of tonight's event. For those who may have joined partway through, just a reminder, this event has been organised by No Cold War Britain, which is a part of the No Cold War International campaign, which was set up to oppose the new Cold War and its dangerous consequences, and also to provide space to hear a range of perspectives that unite around wanting a world based on anti-imperialism, anti-racism, social justice, and peace. Just a quick word again on social media. I'm sure you all want to stay in touch with us, but obviously to keep up to date in terms of events and various articles, etc., that we share. You can find No Cold War on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and we'll pop the details in the chat in a moment. And just to say that our key goal at the moment is to challenge the Cold War consensus and build an alternative point of view on the need for a foreign policy based on global cooperation, not confrontation. Another reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available afterwards on the No Cold War YouTube channel. And I think this is something Fiona mentioned and has been popped in the chat, but I'd encourage you all, as people are providing their contributions, to think of relevant questions that you'd like to ask the panel and just put them in the Q&A function, because we'll be taking a selection of questions to put to the panel during the Q&A section towards the end. Before I introduce our next speaker though, and this is something that was alluded to by a number of the previous speakers today, it's just worth sort of reminding people of the supposedly sensible logic of our so-called mainstream, i.e. the threat of nuclear confrontation is present and increasing, yet in this so-called mainstream we see casual talk of references made to limited tactical battlefield weapons of a nuclear nature. Now, of course, these can have devastating effects for humans and our habitat, but it's not just the impact of the weapons themselves, it's also the potential escalatory effect. And this is something, a point I make quite often, but I think it's important to remember. Some of you will remember during 2017 and 2019 general election campaigns, Jeremy Corbyn was asked whether he would push the button in reference to nuclear Armageddon, and the sensible position was to push the button, and the so-called extreme position was to pursue a path towards peace. So this is what we're in effect up against, and it's just worth reminding us of that. I think just continuing, if you like, that logic, ponder something I was reading a couple of months ago now, but it sort of sums up this point quite well, that our mainstream see nothing wrong with firing a $70,000 missile from a $28 million drone flying at a cost of $3,600 per hour to kill people in countries thousands of miles away that have neither attacked, threatened to attack, or posed any threat to us. And this is, as many of the speakers alluded to, across the world, from Libya to Afghanistan. It's the modus operandi of many of the NATO powers. But the cost, both financial, human, moral, political, environmental, is not considered in the mainstream calculus of war and power. And as Bob mentioned, what else could the money and resources be used for? Just a quick quote that I was reminded of again. It's someone who's not particularly radical, an IR scholar named Andrew Basevich, who summed up this point well. We live in a country where if you want to bomb somebody, there's remarkably little discussion about how much it will cost. But then you have a discussion about whether or not we can assist people who are suffering, then suddenly cost becomes very important. Now, it would take just 5% of the US military budget to end global hunger. And the US, as an example, would still be higher than the nearest rival countries combined. Yet while they spend nearly $1 trillion on military, which I think was also alluded to by a number of speakers, people die from poverty, hunger, and have to set up GoFundMes for medical care. And the situation is similar in Britain too, where we have people literally dying from hunger. So the challenges are manifold, and it's a reminder again of the importance of these kind of discussions and organizing for a different narrative in a different world. And on that note, we have our next speaker, who's Micaela Tracey-Ramos, UNISON activist, and I'm very pleased to have a younger voice represented in this campain.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I think it's a really important topic. So I'm a UNISON activist and I'm a local government worker. And as a young trade unionist, I've seen how the cost of living crisis disproportionately impacts young people who are more likely to be on low wages, precarious work with poor renting conditions. Working class people in Britain are dealing with the worst cost of living crisis in history, skyrocketing bills, and the highest food prices in 45 years. The government's agenda of austerity has meant myself and my colleagues in the public sector are hugely overworked and underpaid, and this is seen right across public services. Whilst the government insists there is no money for pay rises for public sector staff and our public services, there always seems to be enough money for military spending and international policies that directly impact the British economy in a negative way. Whilst working class people in Britain and the trade union movement are acutely aware of how the cost of living crisis is negatively impacting us, there seems to be less of an understanding of how this ties into our aggressive foreign policy, and increased links between the peace movement and the anti-austerity movement need to be strengthened. British foreign policy under both Tory and Labour governments have been pro-war and aggressive internationally as the orchestrators of British imperialism. Britain plays an active role in NATO, an aggressive military pact which stands for war and intervention at the service of the US. With their hugely superior firepower and resources, the troops, missiles, navies and military bases of NATO's powers now form a vast circle around Russia and the People's Republic of China. Today, NATO is misrepresented by the British media and government as a purely defensive pact, a peaceful alliance with the historic mission of protecting so-called Christian Europe from the swell of class militancy that was ready to sweep across the continent after the win in 1945. NATO defines its three essential core tasks as collective defence, crisis management, and cooperative security. However, NATO has a long history of direct and criminal intervention in domestic politics and plays a major force in imperialism worldwide. It fights in the interests of the West monopoly capitalist organized corporations. We see this unfold in the war between Russia and Ukraine, with NATO as the primary antagonist. The attempts by NATO to draw Ukraine into a destructive conflict with Russia is one of the main causes of the war, exacerbating tensions around natural resources and the military maneuvers, which have contributed to the escalation of the tensions and the existing imperialist interests. At every stage, British and US diplomats have sabotaged attempts at a negotiated de-escalation, instead goading their Ukrainian partners to carry on, all while exposing the Ukrainian economy to increasing intense exploitation. Despite the imperialist propaganda that is fed to us in Britain and the Western world, NATO does not stand for peace. The fighting in Ukraine intensifies, and NATO looks to speed up the flow of weapons in its proxy war against Russia. The NATO Secretary General said that the Western military alliance needs to ramp up arms productions and increase the number of weapons sent to Ukraine. 1 year on from the start of the war, the British Foreign Secretary addressed the recent UN conference, urging military support for the Ukraine for as long as it takes. Britain has provided 2.6 billion in military support to Ukraine in 2022, more than any other country other than the US, and is going to provide further billions towards the war. How can Britain talk about peace in Ukraine, but on the other hand, ramp up weapons productions and increase military spending? How can Britain and NATO claim to stand for peace? The youth and the working class of the world and do not benefit from NATO's interests of imperialism, who are with the interests of capital and not with working class people. In a cost of living crisis, and whilst Britain is in an economic crisis, how can we justify this extortionate spending on military intervention and war? At the same time, the People's Republic of China stand for peace, meeting both Zelensky and Putin to negotiate an end to the war with the only way possible, through dialogue. China is a global leader in the struggle for a more multipolar, peaceful world where countries have their own sovereignty, which is a direct threat to the dying imperialist global order. In 2023, the British government's latest policy paper outlined the priorities for Britain, singling China out as challenging the international order that they would like to see. Another threatening move by the British government is to involve themselves in the AUKUS military pact alongside Australia and the US, another excuse to entrap China. Britain is expending an extortionate amount of money to send submarines to involve themselves in the Indo-Pacific region and around China. They state that the submarines will help maintain their commitment to defending the Euro-Atlantic region, adding to the work that they do through NATO, the alliance's biggest European contributor. The Prime Minister also announced last month the additional $5 billion will be provided to the military of defence. Again, this is an extortionate amount of money which could have been invested in our public services and people of this country. Furthermore, this further impacts our relationship with China. Whilst our economy is stagnating, China's is increasing and this directly goes against the interests of British workers in this country. In the wider trade union movement, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to provide a broad pro-peace movement. Motions in support of increasing military spending passed at TUC conference. Many trade unions had a reactionary pro-war, pro-NATO motions proposed at their conferences as policy, despite being against British workers here. Just a day or so ago at Scottish TUC conference, a motion supporting members to donate to the ITUC's financial appeal for Ukraine and continued support for sending arms to Ukraine was passed. Whilst this motion condemned NATO, its continued support for sending arms to Ukraine emphasises the confusion amongst the British trade union movement and that there is a long way to go in building a broad pro-peace movement in the Labour movement. Further to this, at the Scottish TUC conference, which started on Monday, a motion against Britain's involvement in AUKUS passed narrowly, but with trade unions like GMB and Unite espousing arguments around increasing the number of jobs for British workers. Despite overall, this would impact on poor relations with China and is against the interests of British workers. But as trade unionists, we should be internationalists and building up a support for an alternative vision in the wider trade union movement in order to oppose the Cold War on China and Russia. In the struggle for peace, we must be more organised than ever in combating imperialism and ready to fight back for the interests of and the rights of the youth and working people worldwide. So solidarity to everyone who's involved in building a broad peace movement in Britain and worldwide.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Wise words from Micaela there, and essential points shedding light on the connection between war expenditure and where it could be better spent. Indeed, to paraphrase Tupac, there's no money for public services, but plenty of money for wars. And it was also important to identify the true nature of NATO, particularly in the context of British and Western reportage as a self-described defensive alliance, when in fact, as history and tragically the people of Libya, to take one example, will testify that it's in fact an aggressive militarist alliance. And important as well to identify the alternative model being pursued by China and others around the world, exemplified by the recent peace deals between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also the prospective peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, showing that there is another way and another path towards peace. And also important to draw attention to peace motions and the necessity across the trade union movement to push for those, especially given the unfortunate fact that the left within Britain is often quite confused when it comes to certain conflicts. Moving on now to our next speaker, Michael Burke, economist from Socialist Economic Bulletin. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Sequoyah, and thanks to all the organisers for inviting me to this meeting this evening. I think it's really excellent. I want to provide some context for what our task is, because I think it was Fiona who said at the outset, we're part of the global majority opposing the war. In this country, I think it's actually quite remarkable that about a quarter of people oppose the war, given the universal clamour for war that we've seen from the media and from leading politicians. And I think our task is to try to get a greater coordination politically and hopefully in practice between the millions of people who've either been directly involved in strike action or family members have or friends have, and that huge movement that's taken place, and the essentially quarter of the people who oppose war and try to build the links between them in this country to develop both. So my task, I think, as I see it this evening, is to try to provide some arguments, facts, and so on in relation to trying to do that. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to provide some data on the UK military spending. I'm going to try and give a little bit of context to that, and then tiny little bit of economic theory at the end, which I hope won't put anyone off. I've got a little sheet that I can put into the chat, so no one needs to sort of rapidly scribble anything that I'm saying, if they were even tempted to, because they it'll be on that sheet and I'll put it in the chat as soon as I finish speaking. I think what we should say first is that the British government is engaged in gross overspending on the military. Firstly, in relative to everything else it does, military spending is rising, and almost every aspect of public services is being cut. In fact, the last budget showed that overall spending on public services is being cut even before you take into account inflation. And we know, as Micaela mentioned, the rampant inflation rate still over 10%. So you can see what that's going to do to ravage public spending in real terms. That's the first point, that there is a magic money tree for military spending, and yet everything else is unaffordable. Secondly, if we look at it in relation to other countries, even within the NATO alliance, as people have mentioned, Britain, apart from the United States, spends far more than any other country. And one way of illustrating that is that Britain spends more on the military than Germany, Belgium, Denmark, and the Czech Republic combined, which is quite astonishing. These are not small countries, and they're not poor countries. And if you really thought that there was an imminent conflict in Central Europe with Russia, then surely Germany would be at the forefront of spending. It doesn't feel the need to do so, although there are pressures on it. So this is a grossly bloated military budget. And then, as helpfully provided by NATO itself, its own analysis of countries' spending, it separates out the US and then combines the key leading European countries and Canada together. And Britain spends far more than the average of that group of countries as well. So that's one measure. And that's what the sheet I'll put in the chat deals with. But I think it's important to provide a context for the numbers, because, billions can mean not very much. They're such large sums that they tend to lose any impact in terms of consciousness about where or how much this amounts to in real spending. So for one example I can give is that the situation is actually even worse than has been the case, because over the next 5 years, MOD spending is going to be rising by 11 billion. That's just over 2 billion a year. People are quite right, 5 billion the next 2 years, but then two extra billion each of the subsequent 3 years. Now, if you just take one example, if you were to pay the junior doctors their full claim to restore all the real terms cuts they've had over more than a decade, that would cost you about $1 billion a year. That shows you how much this spending is costing them and is costing us in terms of the impact on the health service. And if you were to cut back British military spending to the average of that EU Canada total that NATO identifies, you could probably cover the entirety of all the public sector strikes that we've seen over the past period with an inflation matching pay rise. That shows you how much that outsized spending impacts on what then are the priorities for government in savaging public services, including public sector pay. And then finally, what I just want to do is talk, this is the tiny bit of theory, because one of the ways in which you could alternatively spend the gross overspending in the military is by investing in the real economy, to grow the real economy in terms of adding to the means of production. There's only two ways of sustainably growing an economy over the medium term, and that's if you add labour, and I don't think anyone should ever really be advocating that we work existing people just harder and harder, or you add capital. So investing in the means of production is the key way to develop the sustainable economy. It creates jobs, and and it allows further goods and services to be produced using those means of production. Now, one of the key arguments that people have referred to, arguments that have some traction inside the trade union movement too, is that military spending creates jobs. But in fact, the number of jobs created is tiny. In those that are actually engaged in the production and manufacture of weapons in this country amount to 2 workers in every 1,000. So it's a tiny fraction of the overall workforce. It's not significant in terms of job creation. And more to the point, if we take spending, R&D spending by the government, it spends about 30 times on military R&D as it does on R&D in renewable energy. Imagine what would happen if the priorities were switched and it was spending on R&D in renewable energy that was replaced the military research, and what the impact that would have on cutting energy bills, on meeting global emissions targets, and on providing good jobs. So you see that the argument doesn't really hold water. And therefore, I think it's quite important to tackle that argument head on. The key argument, I think, in the end, is that if you invest in the means of production, that allows sustainable growth. We should be clear that investing in weapons in the way the government does has no positive spin-off effects whatsoever. As I already mentioned, even the claims about jobs are false. And what you're actually spending money on is the means of destruction, because either they're completely wasted in terms of weapons you never use, or actually in many countries, not excluding this one, they are weapons you use overseas. And what they do is they destroy people's lives, they destroy communities, and they destroy the infrastructure on which you could base future prosperity. So it's a really straightforward choice. It's investing in prosperity and the future, or it's investing in destruction, poverty, death, and misery. That's the real choice that's at stake. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. And well laid out those various tasks. I think my key task was trying to keep up with the economic theory, but also the other good thing there is it's a sort of tacit invitation to yourself to come back and expand on that economic theory. But some very important points, and some of them really stood out, the 30 times spent on more military, on renewable energy. And there's almost beautiful simplicity really at the heart of your point in terms of investing in weapons representing an investment in the means of destruction rather than the means of production. And I think that sums it up quite well really. Prosperity or destruction. You sort of reminding me slightly of socialism or barbarism. But that brings us very nicely onto the next part of the webinar, which is the Q&As. We've got a decent amount, and so I'm just going to take it in 2 rounds. We've got 8 questions in total, so I'm just going to do a round of the first 4 and then the second. And so the questions are, I'll just quickly read them out and then get a bit of feedback from the panel. If you can sort of keep your answers to a fairly succinct amount of time, 1 or 2 minutes. So the first question is, how do we challenge the non-reporting of events or voices which are inconvenient or contradictory to mainstream narratives? It's quite broad there, but you can answer it how you see fit. And then secondly, hello hosts and panelists, great remarks and presentation by everyone. I'm wondering if anyone can answer, why has it been so hard to mobilize a large anti-war, anti-imperialist movement against the pivot to Asia, even during the Vietnam War, throughout the anti-war movement, etc., They were able to mobilize. That said, positive remarks in relation to the new Cold War. I won't read out the whole thing, but hopefully you get the gist of that. The third one, does anyone know whether depleted uranium ammunition is still going to be sent to Ukraine, or has it already? I think there's certainly Kate and perhaps one or two others will have an in-depth answer to that. And the fourth one of the first round, what do panelists think should be the relationship between No Cold War and existing anti-war organisations, which have a record of mass protest, mobilisation and support throughout the UK labour movement, such as Stop the War Coalition? So I'm going to single out Kate Hudson first, please.
Thanks very much. Just trying to put my notes together, but never mind, that's fine. Yeah, so thanks everyone for their great speeches and also for those interesting questions. I mean, first of all, to Tom, who I know well from CND, we discussed this kind of thing quite a bit on our National Council. We know that in recent times, particularly, the voices of the peace movement are being excluded in a way they never were before. And we've experienced this particularly since the start of the war on Ukraine. And we've had to increasingly find alternative ways of getting our messaging out there. You know, we've done the complaining to the BBC about all that kind of stuff, but we have to find alternative methods of communication and alternative forms of media. Fortunately, there's a lot of opportunities for that these days. Secondly, with regard to Yuri's point, I think a key factor is saturation by essentially government pro-war propaganda, and the kind of overwhelming kind of impact of that on debate, and it links to the first one in terms of the exclusion of alternative voices, because it's not just government propaganda. Of course, when it comes to things like being anti-NATO, both CND and Stop the War are very strong on an anti-NATO position. CND's been opposed to it since CND's foundation decades ago. These are very strong ongoing campaigns, and we're linked in with global campaigns against NATO. But when you've got a situation where the Labour Party leadership prevents its own MPs from criticising NATO under kind of penalty of being, excommunicated from the party, it does make it increasingly difficult to do that, but we continue to do that work. And I urge everybody to get involved in those anti-NATO and anti-New Cold War campaigning activities. To highlight, actually, just to say that this year the NATO summit is coming up in July in Vilnius. It's going to be difficult for us to do our normal kind of counter summit there. There's absence of a peace movement really in that region, but it's likely there will be activities in Brussels and other things internationally as well. So please do try and get involved in that campaigning. With regard to DU, it's either there or on its way, in spite of all the protest and shock about sending depleted uranium munitions to Ukraine. I understand the government's still going ahead with it. Thanks to Jerry for that question. And then to Richard, what should the relationship be between No Cold War and other peace organisations? I think that we don't want to have a kind of proliferation of lots of different things. We all need to be together. I think No Cold War does a very good job in highlighting these issues around China and the global dynamics. Both Stop the War and CND have policy supporting No Cold War, and we just need to work together. We all have different strengths and priority interests. Obviously, if you're particularly keen on opposing nuclear weapons, you come to CND, but we just need to be together on this and continue to build a strong, united movement when we are all pretty much under attack. We just need to reverse that and work together to do that. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Kate. Cooperation is the key. It's a nice theme, can't argue with that at all. And next over to Bob, please.
Did you say me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think Kate's covered a lot of it. I mean, I do think I would be very surprised if they haven't sent depleted uranium over. I think it was one of the things that when we were in Yugoslavia, we went to Kragujevac, where there was a huge sort of company there. It was the center of the whole town's livelihood, and it mainly made tractors, but there was one bit of it that made very old classic hunting rifles that were a big thing in America. And it was quite an amazing destruction of the area that the Americans did. And one of the things that we went into the factory and saw, you know, the blood on the floor from the people who'd occupied them, so they weren't going to lose their livelihoods. And the people who took us there then took us to what was the remains of a broken water system. And that's when they got out Geiger counters and showed us them going off and making their bleeping noises. And we couldn't stay there for very long because the whole of that water system had been hit by depleted uranium bombs. And they were doing it then, and they weren't supposed to do it then. And I'm sure that they're doing it now. The issue about the trade unions, I think, is an important one, and it's a sad one in one sense that, you know, we reached the situation at the last TUC where the motion supporting the war in Ukraine, or not opposing the war in Ukraine, was carried pretty much by you know, it was half and half. It was not a huge majority, but it showed the strength of some of those unions, as Kate talked about, in working in those industries that felt that that was important. I hope it's not a bigger you know, sense that people are actually becoming more supportive of war. But I think, you know, that's something that we need to watch. And it was heartening to see that the Scots had a motion at their TUC, and that was carried opposing the AUKUS stuff there. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. And over to Micaela, please.
Yeah, I don't really have like a huge amount to add to that. In terms of the question about why it has been hard to mobilise anti-war movement, Kate covered quite a lot of it and Bob covered a lot of it, but there's a huge amount of propaganda in Britain, especially since the war in Ukraine, a lot of anti-China propaganda, and also an increase of other alternative narratives being sidelined. So anything that isn't pro-NATO is seen as the sensible policy, and anything that is, you know, anti-NATO is seen as something that's like really crazy, or like that is, and it's been massively sidelined as well, with both Labour and the Tories being two of the largest parties in Parliament being both unequivocally pro-NATO, and other smaller parties in even such as the Green Party have also become more increasingly pro-NATO. I think that's part of the reason why it's been harder to mobilise. And also in the trade unions, that there's like a confused, there seems to be like a confused position on it. So whereas a lot of our British trade unions have very good, do a lot of good international work in terms of with organisations like Cuba Solidarity, a lot of those activists are also supporting reactionary pro-war and pro-NATO motions at their conferences. So I guess that's a challenge for us. And I think in terms of whether No Cold War should work with organisations like Stop the War and other broad organisations opposing war, we absolutely should. We should be trying to build as much of a broad movement as possible against NATO, pro-peace, and an anti-imperialist movement as well, because it's too much of a critical issue to not be working together. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant, thanks, Micaela. In a sense, the tougher the obstacle, the greater the importance of our work. Can we go over to Roger, please?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, can I just, there's just two of the questions that I want to say something about. The first one from Tom, I think it was, which is about the media and getting our message out there, essentially. Well, firstly, buy the Morning Star, popularise the Morning Star. We need more people who are reading the paper and sharing the paper and sharing the news from the paper, because what we're doing is we're amplifying the voices of people who don't get a voice anywhere else. It is as simple as that. If you look at the pages of the Morning Star, and you can disagree with what's said or not, or agree with us, that's fine, right? But the point is that most of the people who we go to for comments don't get to comment anywhere else in any other part of the media, and I think that's important. So that's my advert for the Morning Star. But also there are also lots of other attempts being made to have a progressive, more progressive media platform. So like Globetrotter is excellent. If you don't look at the work that they do, then you should. People's Dispatch is something that I look at every single day. They have a daily briefing from the People's Dispatch, which you can look at on YouTube, which is a half an hour of progressive news about what's happening around the world, which is superb, and frankly you don't get anywhere else, not even from another one that I watch, Democracy Now. For me, you look at People's Dispatch and you're hearing about what's happening from the global south, and I think that's really important. I think as well, one of the things that I would hope that these nations who are coming together through BRICS and whatever emerges out of moves to get a kind of reinvigorated non-aligned movement together, is that they don't just see it as something where it's an opportunity to bring leaders together. I think this is an opportunity to bring working people together as well. So I hope that they look at ways of making sure that people from all of the countries that I mentioned before, so and all of the countries that are looking now to get involved in the BRICS, the opportunities to bring people who are not kind of recognised elected politicians somewhere, but people who are grassroots activists together. And the point about the trade unions is the other point that I wanted to make, because I don't think there's any confusion at all from the trade unions, to be honest. I think what we have to recognise is that that the vast majority of trade unions in the UK are right wing, and that they are not led by the left. And I think that is a real difficulty, even though many of those unions that were forced to take strike action over these last few months, they didn't want to do it. There's a whole bunch of them. There's at least one that I can think of that couldn't wait to get out of it. So I think we have to recognise that there's politics within trade unions as well. They have their political outlook, and a whole bunch of them are, criminally loyal to Starmer and will do anything to stay in his good books, because presumably they think they're going to get something out of that if and when he becomes prime minister, because they seem to forget the fact that he's a liar and he will not go through with anything that he promises, as the whole world can see. So I think that the task there for us is we can complain about the unions, we can say that they're not with us and they're, there's a difficulty with them. The task for us, as always, is to win the trade unions to the left. And I think we have to remember that is still a key part of our task. Otherwise, we won't get around this nonsense that we hear about people not even being able to utter the words NATO within their unions, not even being able to utter the words NATO within the Labour Party, because people will get thrown out. The only way around that is to win those organisations to the left. If you're not prepared to win the Labour Party to the left, well, there's plenty of good left parties out there like the Communist Party that you should be joining and coming and helping us to do the work as well. So I think there's a massive task for us to do that isn't just about sitting around and I'm not saying we're doing that, but just sitting around and having nice conversations with all of us who agree with each other. What we need to do is to find ways of going out and engaging with those people who don't agree with us at the minute and winning them to what we believe. Thanks.
Excellent, Roger. I'm reminded of a conversation I had years ago there in relation to the old adage that knowledge is power, but you've just reminded me that it's not knowledge that's power, it's what you do with it that's real power. So a powerful reminder there. Finally, Michael, and apologies if you could make it as quick as possible, we'll fit a very quick extra round in after your contribution. Thanks.
I can make it really quick, Sequoyah, because I don't really have anything to add to what people have said.
You get the award for Mr. Succinct there, thanks. Okay, so yeah, just a quick final round of questions. We've got around 8 to 10 minutes left. So we've got quite a long question, so I'll distill it, the essence of it. In terms of the ruling class, can we successfully use their greed against them? We also have the heart. We're basically seeing the death throes of empire, and dying empires historically resort to aggression, looking at the best way to get through it and building resistance until a new power builds in. Is that a priority? Is that something we should be doing? Specifically, and I think this might have been touched on, but this was specifically to Micaela and others who work in the union. So Roger comes to mind, but there are others. The difficulty in terms of NATO and the pivot to Asia in gaining traction for opposition, and what basically expanding upon the difficulties and challenges and what the best approach is there. And finally, it is a scary thought, but do you think we are heading for another world war? So I will change things up a bit and start with Bob, if we could try to make them relatively quick.
Yeah, in my day job, I work for the RMT, and I think most people have a vision of the RMT and what they are like. And it was a shock a couple of years, or just around the time of, a couple of years ago now, where they passed a pretty much an anti-China motion. They were taken in by, people at their conference that actually had an idea that China was the problem as opposed to the West. And, that just brought it home to me how easy it is for these things to change, because there's too little, as Roger said, of really good political education and discussion that goes on about things like this. Sometimes it seems to be too remote for people to get their head round, and in a different way that isn't something that they can actually change. But the reality is they need to actually understand these things and do what they can to ensure that not only we are fighting for the right things in work and, as part of the crisis, the cost of living crisis and everything else, the war and the potential war is vitally important just as much. So I think, that is a very good point, and it's one we've all got to learn. And I think that was clear from the TUC and the vote that they took. We need to be doing more. We need more people involved in No to the Cold War, just as we do No to Stop the War and everything else. CND, all the organisations need to be bigger and rebuilt at the moment, because sadly we're not doing as well as we should be doing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. And can we get Micaela next, please?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Could you repeat the second question? Because I kind of didn't really understand what it was specifically asking. The one that was more that was towards me.
Oh, the one that was directed towards you. Okay, so
Yeah.
to Ms. Ramos and others who work closely with unions, are many unions and the members very much against the pivot to Asia and NATO? Are there lots of difficulties in having unanimous opposition against these imperial institutions and the idea of a possible war with China?
I probably just agree with what Bob said and what has been said before. There needs to be more political education of like lay membership in the trade unions. I think people get brought in by a lot of propaganda. Union members are just normal people, so they're going to be as easily brought in by the propaganda by a lot of other normal people. So political education is key as well, but also building that, like building an alternative vision amongst the trade unions and building a broad pro-peace movement, so that we can actually challenge the narrative, the pro-war narrative in the turn against countries like China, and encouraging trade unions to read like alternative media like the Morning Star as well. But I don't have anything really else to add.
That was great. Thank you very much, Micaela. And we'll go over to Michael, then Roger, then Kate, please.
Yeah, very quickly, I just think we should recognise where we're starting from, which is about a quarter of the population here opposes the war, and a global majority opposes the war, and how we get from where we are to part of the global majority in this country. And I think that's long and arduous, and it's difficult, and it involves many different things, but that's the task we've got ahead of us. We shouldn't be so surprised. The war in Iraq was the exception, not the rule, where there were millions on the streets opposing it. The lots of other wars, there was no equivalent when it was the war in Afghanistan. There was no equivalent with the bombing and invasion of Libya, and so on and so on. History is not replete with lots of examples where millions take to the streets against our government's wars. And I think it's probably an error to assume that we can get quickly from where we are to there. There was a specific set of circumstances, not least a big split amongst European governments, particularly the French government, about the war, and that offered a big opening for the anti-war movement internationally. This is much more difficult, but it's hard work, and there's no point shirking it.
So, thank you very much. And over to Roger, please.
Thanks. Just really quickly. So I often think that when my ancestors were enslaved, that it must have been really difficult for them to think that they could ever win. But you know what, they did. And it must have been really difficult under colonialism for anybody to think that you could actually beat these people with all their power, that you could ever free yourself from colonialism. Well, there's different kind of colonialism now, but of course, people did free themselves from that particular colonialism. So I'm forever the optimist, actually, and I believe in people. And I believe that when people organize together, that we can really shift things. So for me, and Bob knows this, I mean, we've been working together for, I don't know, 20 years probably, but it's organizing is the key. If we just think that having nice conversations is going to do it, it simply won't. And history teaches us that that's the case. So we have to do the hard graft of organizing and going out and getting amongst those people who are influenced by the media, that isn't the Morning Star and isn't the other progressive platforms, and we have to go out and engage with them. And sometimes that's really uncomfortable. Sometimes they're going to kick us out of the room, right? But sometimes we're going to shift people. And when we can shift people, I think that's where we're going to really start to see the differences, because that's all that's ever happened in the past. When, you know, those campaigns against, you know, when people resisted enslavement, when people resisted colonialism, when people resisted, you know, some of the real harshest things that working class people have had to put up with over the years, is because we've got together ourselves and organised. So I think that the last thing I want to say is that it's also worth remembering, if we want to mobilize the global majority, there's lots of people from the global majority who are in this country, who live and work and have done for years in this country. And I think we could do maybe a lot more about looking at how we mobilize those people who've got all these contacts in the global south in particular, but also understand about oppression, understand about the way that systems treat you, you know, the way that the police treat you, the way that you know, employers treat you. So they've got that experience that maybe we need to think a little bit more about how we can tap into some of that vast experience. So just finally, you know, it's in our hands. It isn't in somebody else's hands to do this stuff. As you know, June Jordan, as I always say, June Jordan once said, and the great writer and activist, we are the ones that we've been waiting for.
Brilliant, thanks, Roger. And you reminded me of another quote. I think it was Alice Walker, who said that the most common way that people give up black power is by thinking they don't have any. And indeed, we are power. Final couple of minutes to Kate before I close things.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to everyone for the great remarks there. I'm just going to answer two. The first one is from Felicity, where she's talking about the death throes of an empire and looking at the best way to get through it and building resistance until the new power builds in. Right. So I want to take up a couple of issues with that. So first of all, you're talking about what I think is referred to as the Thucydides trap, which is where a kind of a dominant or hegemonic power, you know, fights to the bitter end to prevent another power coming up. I think it was Sparta trying to prevent Athens or something in ancient Greece, you know. Okay, we have to do everything we can to prevent that war taking place. That's the first thing. We don't want that war. But also, in my view, we don't want another empire bedding in. We don't want to hang around waiting for that to happen. We want a multipolar world. You know, we want the kind of world that Roger's been talking about. You know, the global south coming to the fore in the way that it must do, you know, and playing the role that it must do. And we want many, many countries fulfilling their potential. We want countries living together in peace and justice, environmentally sustainable. You know, that's the kind of multipolar world that we're looking for. So we've got to prevent war and build that multipolar world. And as a final comment, yes, I think we could well be on the way to World War III, and that would be a nuclear war. And we have to prevent that at all costs. And that is what we are fighting for. We're fighting for our future, for the future of the planet, and let's really work together and fight for peace. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kate. I'll just quickly wrap things up then. In the context of our media climate where diplomacy and negotiation are denigrated and even ridiculed, events like this are essential to offer a challenge to these, what I would describe as distortions of humanity. We're told that arguing for negotiated peace is the extreme position, but arming neo-Nazis and escalating towards nuclear Armageddon is totally reasonable. But it doesn't need to be this way, as recent negotiations brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the de-escalation of hostilities in Yemen have shown peace and dialogue are both possible and viable, and this is a path we should be supporting and building towards. So thanks again to all our speakers for brilliant contributions, and encourage you all again to follow our social media channels to stay up to date for future events and activities. So I better end it there before I get into trouble, and have a great evening, everyone.